Great Monday, and welcome to the Fully Human Connections podcast. King, and I'm joined by my co-host Reggie. How you doing today, Reggie?
I'm doing well, King. Approaching, even though it's not winter yet, the weather feels a little bit wet and damp and cold out there. But I can't complain. I'm in a relatively warm home, and I get to do this on a Monday morning again with you. So I'm in good shape. How about you?
Same here. I'm at a 10. And I choose to be a 10. I got some things today, but I'm going to choose to be a 10 despite those uh, challenges and tests to my spiritual state. But I wake up every morning. I'm alive. I can see, hear, walk, talk, stand, breathe as I go into my gratitude moment. Mother who's alive, still has a mind this weekend, every weekend, still has the ability. I still have the benefit and the blessing to be able to spend time with her and still gain from her wisdom and still experience these holidays with her. So, that's still a blessing. And just I speak with you here on the show, opportunity to grow every day as a person, as an individual, see the growth in myself. Again, I'm thankful for my challenges that I have in my life. Those, I believe, are helping me become better as I gain wisdom from learning from my mistakes and improve myself so I can think clearer and grow as an individual and become more fully human. Yeah. So with that being said, what do you say for this morning?
Yeah, so the last piece you just said, you did ask me for my gratitude moment. I think you did. That would
yes, I did. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I just lost that part of your voice there. So I have I woke up today and I had indoor plumbing and heat on a cold morning. I had food in my refrigerator, and I don't take any of that for granted. So I'm just really grateful for that. As you have said, I have, about yourself, I have a relatively, as far as I can tell, relatively sound mind and a pretty healthy body, which I'm grateful for as I'm approaching the completion of my 7th decade. That'll be official in May. I'm just grateful for good friends, for colleagues that I get to work and play with. And even as an example, like this morning, I spent a little bit of time looking for a new electrical supplier because our primary delivery is from Eversource electricity up here in Connecticut, but we can choose different suppliers and look for the best price. And it's like going online and looking for it, and then dealing with each company's website it's not fun to do. So I was getting a little bit frustrated this morning as I was looking for my next supplier. And then I realized, well, I have the opportunity to select one rather than get stuck, keeping with the same price when I can find different options. So I just laughed at myself a little bit, and I can do it all sitting here at my desk. And so I'm just grateful for some of the conveniences and advantages that the technology, which I also have some critiques of, allow me to engage with. So across the board, I'm just grateful for this life and for the certain freedoms that I have, and I get to get up every morning and do things that are important to me and not fit myself into somebody else's workplace doing a job for somebody else's agenda. So I'm really grateful for that, all of it. So your audio is out. I can't hear you. No. Can you hear me?
How about hear me now?
Yeah, you're back. Yep.
Yeah, I'm not sure what's going on with my audio this morning. But yeah, it's such a blessing what you just shared. And technology definitely makes it easier for us to be able to do a lot of things in our life. That's a blessing to have. That's truly technology, I believe, is truly that it's a blessing and it's a curse. as it thing goes both ways because, again, at the end of the day, either it controls you or you control it. One thing though, I wanted to make this point real quick before we start our show. I thought was interesting, going back to my whole concept about systems. I was watching this movie last night. It's called Leave the World Behind. And one of the things that starts off, and it's in the trailer, so it's not a real big, it's a pretty interesting movie. I recommend watch it. But the point of the movie is the internet goes down. And so the internet goes down, there's no GPS, there's nothing, right? This family has to deal with no technology. And what I thought was really interesting, it talks about, again, going back to the systems, is how my question for you is this, and I'm not sure you know the answer or not, but it's really a rhetorical question, is why did they get rid of selling the maps, or printed maps in the gas station stores? Why did they stop selling? I can understand that maybe people didn't buy them as much because we have GPS on our phone, but I'm sure most people would still love to have, especially from baby boomers and Generation X's who grew up with having hard maps, like to have that as a backup. We don't even have that as an option now. So the GPS goes out and there's no stopping at the gas station getting directions. You just right. So like the systems force us to have to use these type of technologies or just be, off the grid. You can't be off the grid. So I just wanted to point that out to see what your thoughts were on that quickly before we start our show. Have you just did a road trip, able to go into a store and even see any hard printed maps that you could purchase in case you needed to?
It's rare. I mean, one of the places I think you can still go in and get a copy of a map, and I haven't done this in a while, so I think it's like a Staples stores, the office supplies used to always have right by their exit, they used to always have a rack of like the big atlases, road maps, and then the smaller fold-out ones, mainly for the local area, and then one of the whole United States. But I agree with you. As somebody who's in his late 60s, I've always driven. I didn't renew it every year, but I always bought a U.S. I think it was a Hagstrom's map, or it could have been AAA. I forget. But I always had the big one. I kept it in the trunk of my car. So I always had a map, and I'm conditioned. And to answer your question, my guess is that not enough people, as you say, were buying maps anymore, especially at the last minute, because generally speaking, the GPS isn't out. Generally speaking, the internet is available. And but I miss the ability to look at a big picture. You can, if you want to see exactly where you are on your phone, you got to zoom in and you just see a couple of streets. If you zoom out, you really can't read the map because everything is too small. So that's why I loved having the big atlas. That said, expanding out your question even further, technology always does that to us, whether it was the invention of fire or the ability to, capture and use fire, the invention of the wheel, the internal combustion engine, flight, all of it, not just, the internet and social media and computers. Technology changes how we live and our value systems. And as you said earlier, it's a matter of using technology and having it and not being used by it or being had by it. And I think we all have some of that because, we don't have anywhere near the privacy we used to. Even if we set all our, we can set our privacy settings as, privately as possible, but there's still information about us that's out there in the world now that there wasn't prior to the World Wide Web. So yeah, I agree with it. I mean, I still have my last Hagstrom's map. Roads get changed a lot. And what I typically do, even when I travel, to your point, because it's good for my brain and I just don't like looking at the phone, I look at my route when I'm going to go somewhere. Like, in fact, last weekend, you and I met for the first time, and I drove down to DC, and I pretty much looked at the map, made a couple of notes and never looked at a map again while we were driving. I knew how to get there. Now, had there been a big delay or a change of route or something, I would have had to make some changes. But generally speaking, that works for me. I don't like relying on my phone to do things other than speaking on the phone. So that's, but that's an age, that's a generational thing. Like I do use it for other things, and I'm not foolish about it. But the fewer times I pick that up during a day, the happier I am. So again, I think that's really generational, because for people in their teens, 20s, and 30s now, I mean, they grew up with that thing. And the idea of getting a big, I don't know if they're 12 by 16 map, I don't know how many pages, and flipping through that to find the right state or the big city and looking at that's not attractive to people that are accustomed to having everything on their phone. So for somebody like me, that's a loss in a way. But for each generation, the world that they're given, again, the cultural givens that you and I talk about, it shifts, often for the better and sometimes for the worst. So I'm glad I'm not a teenager now. It's a scary world to be growing up in.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. My final word on it is I don't mind a change. I just hate when they take away something that they've had for years. It's like you can bring in a new thing, but you don't have to things and force us, like smartphones being every phone now is smart. So finding a flip phone is a challenge, and it doesn't really work as well. Where but we could be later in that conversation. That's another conversation for another show. But I just asked a question. But speaking of the show, why don't you go ahead and walk us into what our true topic for today's show will be?
Yeah, so we've been, for those of you who might be new to this, we are speaking about my book, Healing America's Narratives, the Feminine, the Masculine, and Our Collective National Shadow, with a slight tagline at the bottom there says becoming more fully human, because that's what Healing America's Narratives and dealing with the shadow allows us or invites us to do. And the last few episodes, we've been speaking about the developmental worldview that causes most of the problems in the world today, both locally and at scale globally. And it's an us-centric or group-centric worldview. Another way to say it, it's a binary worldview. It's us and it's them. It's this or it's that. It doesn't allow any space for anything other than this group, that group. And we tied that into the shadow of the United States. We've done this in past episodes. That's dominated by an unhealthy masculine energy, which itself is part of that binariness. This is feminine energy. This is masculine energy. And I think we may have mentioned last week that, in fact, it's all human energy. Cultures over the millennia have separated us into feminine and masculine. Part of that is based on biological facts, right? That there are females and males based on the actual biological sex of an individual. But a lot of it is acculturated. So today, what we're going to take a look at is how that applies. This is something we spoke about over a year ago, probably when we were going through each chapter in the book. But it's good to come full circle and visit it again. Is how that applies in the history of the indigenous peoples of what we now call the Americas, North, Central, and South America, and specifically North America, and that part of North America, which is now known as the United States, excluding Mexico and Canada. And the binary piece comes in, the us-centric piece comes in, because you and I, the history books that we grew up with in elementary school, middle school, and high school, even though, you and I are, I got a decade plus on you, but a lot of it was very similar. The history that we were given was the Euro-American perspective on this continent. In other words, from the arrival of the Europeans to the continents of the Americas forward. What we weren't given of what it was like for those indigenous peoples, the indigenous nations, and there were hundreds of them here, and they were present on the North American continent from some 10 to 20,000 years ago. Not all of them were, but the best research now says of somewhere between 10 and 20,000 years ago that these various indigenous nations, people we now call Native Americans, made their way to the Americas. And more scholars are writing, and I say, are writing basically in the 21st century, there's been more and more traction with this, are writing histories from the perspective of the indigenous peoples, as opposed to the perspective of the European arrivals and then the subsequent Americans, or Europeans who became Americans. And so you're getting the perspective from those who were invaded, who had their land taken away, who were many times slaughtered, who were betrayed in hundreds of treaties by the US federal government, as opposed to the history being told by the treaty makers, the treaty betrayals, the slaughterers, and it's not funny as I said it, but it's a real binary. And so, and that's true for everything else we've spoken about around, African-American history, the history of women. That binary is always there. The founding of this country is grounded in, a white Christian male European value system. And that's not wagging our finger. That's just historically true. It's accurate. And it didn't have a lot of room for people with different skin pigmentations, for women, or for people with different cultures. I mean, even back to the point when the founders, who were British for the most part, weren't particularly happy when the Chinese, the Japanese, the Italians, the Polish, the Germans, and the Jews started showing up to the land of the free, because they were seeing this whole, Anglican place where all men would be equal, but they didn't really see people who spoke different languages and had different cultures and beliefs as being part of it. So again, that's just the background for it. Bringing the focus forward now, specifically for today, is what that meant and what it continues to mean for what's left of those indigenous nations. And again, we tend to say Native American and American Indian as though it's this one monolith, but in fact it was hundreds of very diverse peoples or nations that we've dumped into this one funnel, calling them one thing, Indians or Native Americans. So it's a really, I think it's an important topic. Again, not to whine about it and point fingers about it, which I think there's nothing wrong with either one of those, but just to keep in mind that the land on which all of us live was, in a couple of small instances, attained through treaties that weren't broken. But for the most part, Europeans that showed up settled, and when they wanted more land, they entered into treaties, and then they broke the treaties. And they broke the treaties because they found like minerals like gold and silver or uranium and plutonium, or just because more people were coming over and they needed more land. So this binary of us versus them has done a lot of damage. And I always wonder, what might it have been like if the folks who came over from Europe were able to see the Africans that they kidnapped and the indigenous peoples of the Americas that they removed, slaughtered, and betrayed simply as human beings, and not as those who could be used or misused or abused. Now that's a mouthful, I know, but it's the reality of where we live right now and how we live, because that binary continues in our current politics. It continues in our abilities, our tendencies to try to other different groups based on gender or sexual orientation or whatever. It's present now in even our views on Palestinians and Israelis because of the war going on over there. So it's a really powerful force, this binary us versus them perspective. And because we're living in this country, returning to and looking at what it might look like to have an indigenous history of the United States as opposed to a Euro-American history is something that I think is important. So I'm going to take a breath because that was long.
Another great topic. Takes me back, and I'll never forget this. There was a Chris Rock show 20 years ago by now, not more. And I remember he made this statement in his monologue, talked about how bad, obviously, blacks have gotten in this country and because of racism where we were. What he was making was that Native Americans had it worse. He was saying that he has yet to go into an IHOP and see a Native family sitting there in the IHOP. Like you never see that. So it was his point. And I'm sure that you can probably see that if you go to the more Midwestern states, Nevada, Oklahoma, states like that. You may see that off the reservation. I'm not sure about in those states. But his point was that they've been stacked out so much that you'd never even see a Native American family at all. And as you talk about that in your book, and recently come across different movies that depicted or TV shows that depict a portion of Native American history and some of the things to go through, like even just one show, I'm actually forgetting what show it was now, but it's another show out of Yellowstone's 1945 that captured how the American schools, the Native Americans the children were sent to, and how brutal those schools were, and how they treated those young Native American children. And just kind of see that continual brutally behavior continue to be extended to the Native American people. So my question would be, with that being said, it's kind of a context. What do you see as why America hasn't really, as we seem to be in this woke generation now, where we put forth LBTGQ communities, we put forth African American agendas to a certain extent. Why the agenda doesn't get really discussed and put on a pedestal or put in the spotlight as much as other minority groups during this woke time? What's around that?
Yeah, that's a really important question. I wouldn't pretend to know, one answer that's true, the answer. I have some views on that. One of them. Well, then I just want to backtrack for a second before I just say what I wanted to say about that. Two things about one about the schools you mentioned. I would argue, and I'm pretty sure you agree with this, that even if those schools hadn't been brutal, had they been excellent schools, or they would love the children and they treated them well and all of that, even if that had been the case, the thing that we forget when we speak about those schools is that Americans, and primarily it was Christian, it was Anglicans and Catholics who did this. Most of the schools had a religious, because they wanted to get the innocence or the savage beliefs out of these children so they could learn about Christ. And that was it was an acculturation. But the real, I use the word sin here in kind of in a generic context, was that it was okay. They thought it was okay to take kids from their families. So even if the schools had been wonderful, that wasn't a voluntary thing. they took the kids from their families. Now that the schools were brutal and abusive makes it even worse. So that's the one piece. So when it because of the difference, I'm going to use the African American story because I tell brief snippets of both of those in the book. What ended up happening with enslavement and its end after the Civil War, and then, as we know, 12 years of really ineffective Reconstruction, and then almost a century of Jim Crow and lynchings, and still needing the Civil Rights Act and still needing the Voting Rights Act, and nowadays still having to fight to make sure that poor people and people of color aren't disenfranchised from the vote. So we're still working with that. But at some level, African Americans were invited into the conversation, not perfectly and not completely. But you can see that even in the halls of Congress. You can look at it in major universities. You can see it, in terms of neighborhood and stuff. Again, it's not done, so I'm not, that I'm not saying that there's no work left to do there. In the case of the Native Americans, even after the Civil War, they were still being relocated, and they would get a reservation, and then they would find gold on it or silver or something else, and they would get the government would take more of the reservation, and sometimes settlers would just go across the reservation borders and just settle on it, and that's where there was some killing going on in both directions. So one of the things that I think is really different is that it wasn't this Native American thing, because if you spoke to, and I'm going to just mention a handful of the Iroquois, the Cherokee, the Lakota Sioux, the Paiute, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, the Apache, there are hundreds of them. And so it wasn't this movement really until well into the 20th century of coming together and seeing themselves as American Indians or Native Americans. Whereas the former slaves, to use again, just to differentiate the two movements, the civil rights movements for blacks in America and the Native Americans, even though they were, not all from the same country either, they got made into a monolith of African Americans, regardless of what country they came from. There wasn't that organization until well into the 20th century. And it almost became an afterthought. When I was growing up, the television shows showed cowboys and Indians. Cowboys were the good guys, the Indians were the savages. The television shows, that there weren't a lot of shows that featured any blacks at all. But most of those that I was privy to, that I saw, didn't consider them savages or bad people. So even in the 1950s and 60s, the Indians were the bad guys. So there's this whole cultural piece, and that's a really superficial thing because of a couple of TV shows, but there's this whole cultural piece where because so many indigenous peoples of the United States were slaughtered. I mean, a lot of people refer to that as a genocide. Because there were, I've heard that the numbers as high as 1.3 million indigenous peoples were killed as the United States, came into being and moved across the continent. I don't know the exact numbers. So I think the organizational piece was a big part of why it's not such as well known as some other movements, because they were very disparate groups who had different histories, and it was the Europeans and Americans who lumped them together as Native Americans or American Indians. So that was kind of, I know that was a kind of a meandering, labyrinthine kind of response. That's my best sense of it. I'm sure some scholars could add a lot more to that than I have given.
And I think that Hollywood the media definitely plays a major role as well, because you know, despite the atrocities and racism that Americans have faced in this country, once we got to begin to make our own movies, that gave us a sense of pride. Same thing with the LGBT movement. When they began to make their own movies, they gave them a sense of pride and solidarity around that. You haven't really seen too many Native American movies made by Native Americans to give their story or to show their culture in a different way than normally Europeans making movies featuring Native Americans and by coloring them how they want to be colored. There's a show, it's a comedy on Hulu called Reservation Dogs, which is written by Native American writers, complete Native American actors, and it's a pretty good show as well. And they kind of show you it's like for young teenagers, millennials, Generation Z's growing up on a reservation right now. And they also a little bit it gave you a brief backstory of some of the schools that some of the elders went through. But I'm just now starting to see that, and you get a chance to see what it looks like. And it's interesting because, again, because their story is never really told much, or if it's told from a very historical context, very past context. So you don't see how Native Americans are living today and how they're pretty much assimilating into Americans' culture, regardless of what live on a reservation or not, because they still are going to be listening and watching American-made movies. So that's still going to dominate your culture if you let that come into your world. Your children are going to want to idolize and emulate what they see Native Americans on this show rapping and take on that form of the culture, but then rapping about topics relevant to their tribe and their community. So it's just an interesting dynamic to kind of watch that show and see it from that perspective. Like I said, it's a very enjoyable show. I truly enjoyed it. It's great acting, great writing, but it's the first show that gives you a view into their world growing up right now, not how it looked back when the country's been settled. And that's typically the image I've always seen of Native Americans, or the activists, advocating for more land rights or being again by the government by again treaties still being broken that we see currently in the news. So it's just interesting that you topic because by the same token of how this country has done to Native Americans, how their cultural appropriation has been taken, like within the military. You got the tomahawk, actually using those terms that we see in the sports media with the symbols on, from the Boston. I don't know if the Boston Red Sox. I'm trying to remember. Is that an Indian symbol? But
I don't believe so. No.
Yeah. Okay, not the Boston Red Sox. Other Cleveland Indians, other teams that actually use an Indian mascot. So it's just interesting that for their culture to be stamped and treated as savages and written in history as savages, how their culture has been appropriated, and these things as respectable, such as the militaries and the sports, they've taken their culture and used it for that to glorify, or this is more manly warrior type of team or a warship.
Yeah, I mean, and the cultural appropriation is a real mixed bag, because when it's done disrespectfully, regardless of what culture is being appropriated, that's just, again, ignorance, arrogance, untrustworthiness. There are other times, I mean, in the ideal world, we see aspects of another culture, and because it's in some way attractive, or it's moving, or it teaches us something that we, in the ideal world, we want to be able to share aspects of other cultures without in any way demeaning them. And sometimes the appropriation is done I think in an artistic and respectful way, and other times it's not. So but I agree with you. Using it for naming weapons, using it for sports teams, can be problematic. And even to speak about the reservations now, I forget how many there are, but there are quite a few throughout the country, and they're not equal. There are some reservations, especially, and I can't remember which ones now, so I want to be really careful with my language. But some in the Southwest and some other areas, and I think even in the Northeast, where they're relatively intact and okay economically, and the peoples who choose to stay on the reservation are doing reasonably well, and they have good relationships outside of the reservation. There are other parts of the country, and Pine Ridge comes to mind. I think recently that was one of the poorest demographics in the country, in terms of, the alcohol rates, the unemployment rates, the average age of a male, the longevity rates, it's horrible. So the reservation history and current events is really, it's very unequal. There are some places where the specific indigenous nation has been able to thrive and work with the larger American culture outside of its reservation borders. And there's other places where it's just a really sad, poor, unhealthy place to be. And that's the binary. And so as an example, and this, one of the biggest things that strikes me, and again, I want to say to anybody that listens to this, obviously you and I, King and I, we're not scholars in any one of these particular areas. King knows more about what it's like to be an African American male than I do. I know what it's like to be a second generation Italian American. Neither one of us has ever been a woman. Neither one of us is gay. So we're really careful with our language and what we know and what we don't know. But just as an example, in the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, I'm just going to do this example really quickly. There were certain guarantees made to the Lakota Sioux. And this was in the Dakotas, what are now known as the Dakotas. And there was they're called the Great Sioux Reservation, which is something like 60 million acres. Over the next 20 to 25 years or so, that got reduced down to just under 13 million acres, based on treaty violations and new laws that the federal government passed. In 1979, there's a lot of details in between here, but I'm going to just fast forward. The Supreme Court heard a lawsuit, a case from a lower court that challenged those violations of the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868. And the Supreme Court agreed that, in fact, the United States federal government was wrong, had broken the treaty, and had taken what the indigenous peoples call Paha Sapa, what we call the Black Hills, which was really their sacred land, their sacred ground. Think of Jerusalem, think of Rome, think of different places with different cultures that have a certain sacred element to it. And they awarded the Lakota Sioux, and I'm not going to get the numbers exactly right now, in the general vicinity of $17 million for that land being taken away from them wrongfully, and plus 5 or 7% interest. And I forget what that number was. And basically the Lakota people basically said, well, we don't want your money. We want our land back because that's what's important to us. So you can hear the cultural difference, All right, the land was sacred to them, and the American government said, "Well, here's some money to make up for our betrayal." So to this day, that settlement has continued to accrue interest. It's over $2 billion now. And it just speaks to the difference, the integrity of the indigenous people's views of what was done to them and what was taken. And their stand that that's not what we ever wanted. I mean, you took something sacred that had deep meaning. So the whole binary is so obvious there. Enter into a treaty, you can keep this land, and then goes from 60 million to down to 12 million acres. Oh, we're sorry. Our law now says we were wrong. Supreme Court says in 1980, the decision was handed down. So here's some money to make up for it. And what the Lakota Sioux basically said is, if we took that settlement, even now at $2 billion, what do we really do with that? We divide it up for all of the people on the reservation. They have it, they spend it or invest it, and it's gone, and everything is okay. So it's just this whole, again, the binary, the cultural binary. European American values, in this case, Lakota Sioux values. And I don't know what justice would ever be for that. I wouldn't pretend to know. But that area remains extraordinarily poor. And the $2 billion, which somebody gave me $2 billion, that would be a lot of money. But that would be a Band-Aid on a much larger issue, I think. So it's a real difficult issue that has yet to be resolved, and neither the leadership of the various indigenous nations, not just the Lakota Sioux, nor the leadership of the states within which those reservations exist, nor the leadership of the United States federal government has been able to resolve it. So it's in many ways, it's a shame on the United States for how we got here. And basically money, things, and beliefs were more important than people. It's a oversimplification, but I think it's accurate. So I know I'm giving a lot of, go ahead. I'm giving a lot of long answers today, so I apologize.
No, actually, I think a great detailed answer. I think that's really relevant to the topic. That brings a question to mind, which is, so how do you see this us-binary view of indigenous people continue currently? What do you see as that value of them right now within our media and our society?
Well, the biggest thing, and this is, as I say this, I recognize it's a comment on me, because I've read a lot of contemporary scholarship on Native Americans. That's fine. I wouldn't have written the chapter in the book had I not done that. And I've seen a lot of documentaries and things, and I'm really careful if I can't corroborate certain facts from several different sources. I don't use them, because there's a lot of nonsense out there. I think the biggest thing is the invisibility still of, and again, I'm going to use the monolith of, for many people, from Native Americans. Now, if you live near a reservation, or you live in a part of the country where there's still a strong presence, there probably is more visibility of Native Americans. I can name a few people that, the Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, is the first Native American to serve not only as Secretary of the Interior, but I'm pretty sure in a presidential cabinet. All right. And she's, Joe Biden's Secretary of the Interior. There are some really wonderful scholars and doctors. I mean, two people, one person that I spoke to, actually, I never spoke to him. We emailed back and forth, but a gentleman by the name of Eduardo Duran, who's a PhD in psychology. His mother was Italian, not Italian American, but Italian. His father was, I think, a variety of Native American nations. And he was in the Navy in Vietnam. He came back, studied psychology, and he spent his life, he's in his 70s now. He spent his life working on trauma recovery on Native American reservations. He's brilliant. His work is just brilliant. You're not going to, and he's not online. Like, I heard him speak online, but he doesn't have like a website or anything. So I wrote him I tried to find an email address. I couldn't find it. So I wrote him a letter, and I found, like, on whitepages.com, I found an address, and it took like 2 or 3 months. He actually responded to me. So he's hidden from anybody that's not in his direct life. Deb Haaland is, Secretary of the Interior. Louis Mel Madrona is either Stanford or Berkeley educated MD. He's a psychiatrist. And he works with people at the intersection of modern Western medicine and native, or indigenous medicine. And he brings this wonderful gift of, accepting people where they are, not discounting, what we jokingly call Western medicine as white man's medicine. Oh, here's a pill. So he doesn't discount pharmaceuticals, but it's not his primary tool. So he blends the two of them together. So unless you're engaged in that kind of conversation, you never hear about those people.
Right.
And I only know about them because of my work. I had a conversation with Louis Mel Madrona with a colleague of mine some years ago, because we were doing some work with health coaching, and we wanted different perspectives. And again, Eduardo Duran, I just bumped into on a collective trauma webinar online, and he was one of the guests, and he just transfixed me. He was funny, he was insightful, he was dead serious, in really beautiful ways. So I figured, all right, that's a guy I need to talk to, or get in touch with at least, and read. But I was looking for it. Most of us go about our day-to-day lives. If you're not Native American, why bother with it? Again, I'm not saying I agree with that. I think that's kind of a generic truth. Trying to keep your kids in school, trying to put food on the table, trying to, not get burnt out at work, whatever. And you're not looking for, I wonder how the indigenous peoples of the Americas are doing this week. So I think it's that invisibility for many of us that is the answer to the question. Why? It's because we're not proactively looking, and it's not on our priority list. And that, granted, that's true of many issues. You can't commit to every issue that's important in this country or on the planet today, because you'll kill yourself. I don't mean that literally, but there's just too much. You have to, be selective and do good work in an area or 2 or 3 that are important to you, I believe. I mean, what I did with the book was try to integrate some of that, because, and this is a question you asked me when we began these talks over 1.5 years ago, and you didn't say it this way, but it was, it's like, so as a white guy, which, and I consider myself, Italian American, we weren't considered white when we got off my grandparents weren't treated like white people when I got off the boat at Ellis Island, but nothing like being Native American or African American. So granted, but what qualifies me to write a book about this? And my answer is something like this: it is that idea of privilege, because I had the ability to step back as a male, as a heterosexual white male, again, white in quotation marks for me, and look at all of it And had I been a woman, I might have written more about women's issues. Had I been Native American, had I been a member of, the Saugatucks, one of the tribes in, one of the nations in Connecticut, and maybe I would have focused there. But I had the ability to say, oh, I have a European American background. Here's what the European Americans did, primarily the British, but still, look at all of this. And I was just interested. A lot of my work, even as a coach, is integrating different sources of input and seeing how they fit. But it's not an easy thing to do. Because if you're going to integrate and spread out and try to bring things together, some folks would say that you're kind of diluting things. And I don't think I diluted anything. I think the integration is essential for us to get to that. All of us are in this together. And it's not that us against them binary thing. But it's complex. So I'm going to be quiet now for a moment.
Well, I think that your answer that you gave, just looking at how society views people now, to your point, that goes back to the binary us and them. That's their issue. That's their problem. That's them over there, as opposed to as human beings suffering, or as Americans suffering, even though some may argue they're not American citizens, they have their own reservations. By the same token, they're still part of this country in the context that they live within these, as you said, North-South, North American borders. So it's ways we should be more mindful of them, I think, in our wokeness. If we want to sit here and claim to be so and concerned about human issues, then we should not forget those individuals as well in lawmaking and justice fighting and advocacy work. It shouldn't take a Native American person to get involved with that in order for the woke, so-called woke crowd to be concerned. And that to me is really the crux of why it's so important to become fully human and remove yourself from these tribes that we're forced into here based on our color, our race, our gender, our age, our sexuality, our religion. Because when you allow yourself to be put into those tribes, then you adopt that lens of it's us, as you say, the binary lens, then you justification for not caring and not giving love to anyone outside of your tribe. And that to me doesn't bring that internal intrinsic joy that can be felt when you just give love of a human being. When you help someone just because they're human, not because they're a particular tribe or they're like you in any form or fashion. It's just the fact that it's a human being suffering over there, So as we get near the top of the hour, I just want to hear, or I want to give you the opportunity to say, what can we do to lead us down? How can we heal these binary centric views and begin to start to see everybody that's being as a human being and put ourselves on the path of being more inclusive with our viewpoints?
Yeah, so I'm going to make it kind of Native American specific, because that's how that's the specific example we use today. But I would encourage anyone who listens to this to do a little bit of research. You might be able to find it at your local town hall or even on your town or city's website or whatever, and find out who was on the land that your house or your apartment or your condo sits on right now. Who was there before the Europeans came? Find out which nation it was and learn about them. Some towns, some cities in this country actually do a pretty good job recognizing who was there. Some, they'll just say, here's the founder of our town. Here's the first this, the first that, the first that. And it wasn't the first anything because somebody else was there before them. So I would say just say, take that human look, that fully human look, and just say, oh, there were other human beings here before these roads got paved, before this town got named, before this house was built, or whatever, and just connect with that. See what you can find out about it, and don't feel guilty about it. You didn't do it, but integrate it into your life, that you realize, oh, this is what's true. I'm here. Somebody else was here before me. And I don't mean the previous owner of the condo, obviously. So I would, suggest just to do that, and remember that every single one of them, past, present, and those in the future, was this same species, human. And see if you can orient that way, even for people you disagree with. I'm not saying you have to agree with everybody, but remember that they're all human. And I disagree with a lot of people. So, yeah.
Well, thank you for that. I'm sure that allows, that's a beautiful answer to my question, because again, our show is not just about point issues and the problems before we wrap up, and healing as we begin to look at ways we can heal America's narrative. I think that beginning to start to see each other as human beings, in my belief, is one of the definitely first initial steps, because as you see yourself as a human being, that I believe from my own experience, that's the only one I can really speak from, then you begin to see the important necessity around healing, and why it's important to heal and not carry a lot of the hatred and the baggage of this was done to my tribe, and because this was done to my tribe, then I hate this tribe over here, because again, the engineer in me, no value at all. And that's where it always comes down to, either if there is value or there's no value question for me. And I see absolutely no value in hate and harboring hate and continue to have hate. It's just like walking around with a weight around your neck and saying, this is what this person did to me. I'm going to wear this heavy weight around my neck to show folks that I'm conscious of what was done to me or done to my people. But then the only thing you're doing is hurting yourself, because eventually that arbitrage is going to wear down on you and begin to take away your ability to function fully, because it's going to restrict your ability to be as active and as you might want to be. So thank you for that answer, Reggie. And we've reached the top where we want to end our show as we normally traditionally do, by sharing an example of someone who is fully human, or we believe has shown a fully human, whether they've been someone in the past or someone currently. So I'll give you the mic first and get the opportunity to share who you want to lift up in this space.
Yeah. So briefly, I'm going to use someone as an example of being fully human. Someone I mentioned in the last hour or so, and that's Dr. Eduardo Duran, who's I believe he's out in Montana. But again, Italian mother, indigenous father, indigenous American father, and in the Navy in Vietnam, came back, studied psychology, and has spent his professional career working with indigenous peoples, many of whom were war veterans, not all of them, but many of whom were American military service members, just helping them through trauma and helping them heal through trauma, using a blend of Western psychology and Native American wisdom. And I just found it to be a very generous and fiercely intelligent. And the thing I love is he tells good stories that are pretty funny. So all of that. So I think Eduardo Duran deserves, my deep respect and admiration today.
Excellent. I'm gonna go with Ken Burns, a filmmaker. who I believe is one of my favorite, is my favorite film documentarian. Just the amount of talent and effort and research that he puts into every documentary that he creates. From the Civil War, which I love that documentary, to jazz, which I learned so much about jazz just by watching that documentary, as well as other great documentaries. Continue to put work. He's just recently did one on Muhammad Ali, which I think is another excellent piece. And to me, for him to, like you, white man, but he's able to be emotionally intelligent and see himself as a human being and human beings as he writes about them, as he features them in his documentary films. That to me is key, and you don't feel the bias. You don't watch it and say, "Well, this is from the white man's perspective." Like when I read your book, I didn't feel, "Well, this is from a white man's perspective," and just everything you're saying, even though it's written by a white man. But I felt that you took enough time and effort and research to give voice to the people you're writing about without talking about them in a biased perspective. And I think that to me is key and important. A person who considers himself to be a historian. And so I want to lift up Ken Burns because I believe he actually the mark every single time when he does a movie. And I think he should continue to be lifted up, and this movie should be something that folks should discuss as a way of learning about another time frames in our history of this country as well.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Well, Reggie, again, I want to thank you for choosing another great topic, for writing a book, for, again, the risk, being consistent, being disciplined enough to complete the book on such an important topic, something that is not going to bring a lot of, unfortunately, it's not going to bring a lot, fanfare, which it should be. I think that everyone should be talking about how do we heal America's narratives and how to become more fully human. And I believe that as you plant these seeds along the way, I'm sure they're going to continue to germinate and grow. And hopefully you'll get a chance to see most of it before, you pass on to the spirit world while we're still here in this human form. And hopefully both of us will, Yeah. But hey, thank you for that. Thank you for being present, showing up for the show. And listen, audience, thank you all again for listening to the Fully Human Connections podcast, which we do every Monday at 10 a.m. And until next week, I wish everyone a wonderful week and much success in your journey to become more fully human. Thank you.